On May 27, 2026, the United States Trade Representative announced 3 formal rounds of USMCA renegotiations, exclusively with Mexico. Canada, the other half of this $1.9 trillion trilateral agreement, was not mentioned once. No timeline, no parallel track, no acknowledgement. That silence was a calculated diplomatic signal. Canada's role as an equal partner had been unilaterally downgraded. To understand what this means, we have to look at the architecture of the deal. Under Article 34.7, the USMCA requires a joint review due July 1, 2026. This was supposed to be a trilateral room. By splitting the negotiations, Washington has effectively isolated Ottawa. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It is the culmination of a year-long tariff campaign. Starting in early 2025, the U.S. imposed 50% tariffs on Canadian steel and 25% on aluminum. That matters because Canada supplies 56% of all American aluminum imports. That detail tells you this isn't just about trade. It's about weaponizing critical supply chain dependencies. The economic fallout is already hitting the ledger. In 2026, the automotive sector, a $51 billion export industry for Canada, saw manufacturing jobs in Ontario drop by over 51,000 as plants face 25% tariffs on parts. Washington justifies this pressure by pointing to a $46 billion goods trade deficit with Canada. But here's the reality that framing obscures. When you strip out the oil and gas that America chooses to import, the U.S. actually runs a trade surplus with Canada. The deficit is a narrative choice, not a structural crisis. However, Canada's vulnerability is absolute. In 2024, 75.9% of all Canadian goods exports went to the United States. For some provinces, that represents a third of their entire GDP. Washington understands this existential dependency perfectly, using it to set the terms of every negotiation, while Canada struggles to find leverage outside of an energy relationship that the U.S. remains eager to consume. As we saw in Part 1, the USTR's decision to bypass Canada in the May 2026 USMCA negotiations wasn't a bureaucratic oversight. It was a deliberate strategy of containment. While the U.S. and Mexico moved to synchronize their supply chains for a post-China manufacturing landscape, Canada was left in the cold, dealing with the persistent weight of 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum. This isn't just a breakdown in cooperation. It is a calculated push to force Canada into a specific regulatory alignment before the July 1st statutory review deadline even arrives. The strategy here is what Washington calls enforcement first, diplomacy. By refusing to open trilateral talks, the U.S. is essentially running a coercive two-track system. In the Mexico track, the U.S. leverages concerns over tariff evasion to build a reassuring partnership. In the Canada track, the U.S. utilizes its immense leverage to target domestic policies that have become political red lines for Ottawa. Take the dairy dispute as the clearest example of this asymmetry. During the 2018 USMCA negotiations, Canada agreed to open 3.6% of its dairy market to American producers. However, U.S. officials argue that Canada's implementation was, in the words of one commerce official, an exercise in administrative obstruction, where the allocated quotas were funneled to domestic processors rather than importers. By December 2025, 74 bipartisan members of Congress had signed a letter to USTR Jamieson Greer demanding enforcement action. When Greer tells the Senate Finance Committee that this must be solved through negotiation or enforcement, he is signaling that the U.S. view of the USMCA isn't as a static agreement, but as a dynamic tool of leverage. Here's what that means. Washington is no longer asking for compliance. It is conditioning the very existence of the treaty on Canada's willingness to dismantle its supply management system. This pressure is mirrored in the digital space. The U.S. views Canada's Online Streaming Act, Bill C-11, as a direct violation of the USMCA's digital trade chapters, which strictly prohibit discriminatory measures against digital products. When 27 members of the House Ways and Means Committee labeled the act a discriminatory digital trade barrier in late 2025, they weren't just discussing cultural policy. They were framing the debate as a breach of international law. To Washington, these domestic Canadian laws, like the digital services tax and streaming regulations, are illegal obstacles to American market penetration. The U.S. strategy is to use the leverage of the USMCA review to force a complete rollback of these Canadian digital sovereignty measures. The most revealing moment, however, occurred behind the scenes of the tariff wars, when Canada attempted to retaliate in early 2025 by removing American alcohol from provincial liquor boards, a move that saw U.S. wine exports to Canada plummet by over 77% in a single year. It triggered a massive multi-sectoral pushback from the American Agricultural Coalition for USMCA. Even as these U.S. groups publicly lobbied for the deal's renewal, they were privately urging the White House to use the enforcement toolkit to punish provincial protectionism. This brings us to the core of the strategy. Ottawa's move to diversify away from the U.S. market, doubling non-U.S. exports to $600 billion, is seen in Washington as a hostile attempt to reduce American leverage. Every dollar of trade that flows to Asia through the Trans Mountain Pipeline or through CPTPP routes is one less dollar of hostage capital the U.S. can use in a negotiation. When Prime Minister Carney stated that the era of ever-closer economic relationship with the United States is now over, he wasn't just signaling a policy shift. He was declaring an economic war for independence. Washington's response has been to accelerate the serial annual review threat, keeping the trade relationship in a state of permanent, high-friction instability. The result is a toxic loop. Every time Ottawa asserts its right to manage its own forestry, dairy, or digital economy, Washington views it as a violation of the spirit of the agreement and responds with new sectoral duties. The U.S. is betting that Canada's 76% export reliance on the American market will cause the Canadian economy to buckle before Washington's political will fractures. We are currently watching the final act of this theater of power. The formal review deadline of July 1st is now functionally irrelevant. The talks have moved past the date. The question every firm and household in North America needs to be asking isn't when the agreement will be signed, but rather, is the USMCA even the governing framework anymore, or has it been replaced by a system of rule by leverage, where the U.S. unilaterally dictates terms based on the sector and the week? As we head into the late summer negotiating rounds, watch the tone of the USTR's statements on non-market inputs. If they start explicitly naming Canadian energy or forestry as unfair, we will know that the strategy has moved from reform to total economic subordination. The breakdown of the trilateral USMCA framework into a two-track negotiating reality is no longer just a diplomatic maneuver. It is the new status quo of North American economic relations. As we approach the July 1, 2026 deadline, the joint review envisioned when the deal was signed has effectively been replaced by a system of serial, bilateral friction. Washington is not seeking a stable 16-year extension for all parties, but rather a flexible, high-pressure environment that allows for the continuous extraction of concessions on a sector-by-sector basis. This strategic shift has profound implications for every major player in the global market. For Canada, the policy of ever-closer integration with the United States has reached its logical and painful conclusion. By treating the USMCA review as a site of potential rupture rather than renewal, Ottawa is being forced into a defensive, long-term diversification strategy. Prime Minister Carney's directive to double non-U.S. exports is not merely a budgetary goal. It is a vital, albeit difficult, attempt to rebuild the economic sovereignty that structural dependency had eroded. For Canada, the likely path forward is a fragile balancing act, accepting targeted sectoral managed trade concessions, likely in dairy, digital services, and provincial procurement, while simultaneously pivoting trade infrastructure toward the Indo-Pacific and European markets for the United States. The strategy is one of industrial alignment. Washington is successfully using the review process to force a realignment of North American supply chains to mirror its own domestic security priorities. By isolating Canada and prioritizing structured talks with Mexico, the U.S. is essentially building a hub-and-spoke trade model where the rules are set in Washington and the partners are expected to pre-comply. This is a clear signal to European and Indian markets that U.S. trade policy is no longer about multilateral liberalization, but about bilateral quid pro quo enforcement. The U.S. has decided that its market size is its greatest weapon, and it is prepared to accept the costs of reduced regional efficiency to secure a more controlled and compliant supply chain. For Mexico, the situation is a delicate tightrope. While its inclusion in the formal U.S. negotiating track provides a temporary advantage, it also locks Mexico into a narrow corridor of alignment on China containment and rules of origin compliance. Mexico's win is a seat at the table, but the price of that seat is a deepening integration into the American security industrial complex, leaving less room for independent trade maneuvering with other global powers. The most critical insight here is that the USMCA's sunset clause, Article 34.7, has ceased to be a simple legal review and has instead become a doomsday clock for region. Stability. In a globalized world, predictability is the engine of capital investment. By creating a cycle of annual reviews and indefinite uncertainty, Washington has effectively signaled that no investment in North American manufacturing is safe from future political volatility. We are witnessing the end of the post-Cold War era of frictionless North American trade and the beginning of a transactional, power-based order. The single most important takeaway is this: the USMCA is no longer a contract that guarantees the future. It is a hostage that is being used to dictate the present. Whether this leads to a painful extension or a permanent state of zombie trade depends entirely on whether Canada can prove that its economic value as a partner is greater than the political value of the leverage Washington currently enjoys.